Let's begin with something uncomfortable but necessary. Most of what we call learning is actually memorization dressed up as understanding. We collect answers the way people collect souvenirs, proof that we were somewhere, not proof that we truly saw anything. And the brain quietly adapts to this habit. It stops exploring and starts storing. That's efficient, but it's not genius. If you look at how genuinely original thinkers operate, especially someone like Richard Feynman, you notice something almost childlike about their approach. They don't rush to answers. In fact, they distrust them. An answer, once accepted too quickly, shuts the mind down. A question, when held open, keeps the mind alive. Genius thinking begins the moment you decide that the explanation you were given is not sacred. Psychologically, this matters more than people realize. The human brain is a pattern-completing machine. It loves closure. It loves the feeling of "I get it." But that feeling is often premature. The moment you say "I understand," the brain rewards you with comfort, and then stops digging. The genius move is to delay that reward, to sit in the tension of not knowing just a little longer, to ask one more why when everyone else has moved on. Think about how children learn before they're trained out of it. They don't ask questions to sound smart. They ask because reality genuinely doesn't make sense yet. Why is the sky blue? Why does this fall down? Why does that hurt? They don't stop at the first explanation. They keep drilling until the adult gets tired. Somewhere along the way, we learn that asking too many questions is inefficient, annoying, or unnecessary. We trade curiosity for compliance. Feynman resisted that trade his entire life. He wasn't impressed by big words or polished explanations. If you told him something worked because that's the law, he would smile and keep asking. Not to be difficult, but because he understood something subtle. Explanations that cannot be questioned are often hiding weak understanding. The goal isn't to attack knowledge, it's to stress test it. Philosophically, this habit changes how you relate to reality itself. When you stop memorizing answers and start interrogating questions, the world becomes dynamic again. Nothing is frozen. Everything is provisional. You stop asking, "What should I think?" and start asking, "What must be true for this to make sense?" That single shift forces the brain to build models instead of shelves. Models can be rotated, tested, and applied elsewhere. Shelves just hold things. There's also a quiet courage required here. Asking deep questions risks discovering that some of your beliefs are shallow. It risks exposing gaps. Most people avoid that because identity gets tangled with knowledge. But genius thinking requires a separation. You are not your answers. You are the process that refines them. The moment you protect answers instead of questions, learning ends. Practically, this means changing how you study, how you listen, how you consume information. When you hear an explanation, don't ask, "Do I remember this?" Ask, "What would break if this were wrong?" When you learn a concept, don't repeat it. Try to explain it without jargon. If you can't, the question hasn't been asked deeply enough yet. Confusion isn't a signal to quit. It's evidence you're finally close to something real. And here's the deeper insight. Genius is not about faster thinking. It's about deeper hesitation. It's the willingness to pause at the edge of understanding and refuse the comfort of a shallow answer. That hesitation is where real intelligence forms. So if you want your brain to think like a genius, stop collecting answers for security and start collecting questions for leverage, because the quality of your thinking will never rise above the depth of the questions you're brave enough to ask. After you've trained yourself to ask better questions, something inevitable happens. You hit confusion. Not the mild kind, but the uncomfortable kind where ideas stop lining up and the mental shortcuts you relied on no longer work. Most people interpret that moment as failure. They think, "This is too hard." Or worse, "I'm not smart enough." But that reaction is not a truth about intelligence. It's a habit learned from how we were taught. Confusion is not a signal to retreat. It is the doorway. And this is where genius thinking quietly separates itself from ordinary thinking. Watch how the mind reacts the instant confusion appears. There's a subtle anxiety, a desire to escape, to look for a summary, a shortcut, or an authority who will close the loop for us. Psychologically, the brain is protecting itself. Uncertainty feels like danger, It feels like loss of control. But intellectually, confusion is the exact moment when the brain is being forced to reorganize itself. No confusion means no restructuring. No restructuring means no real learning. This is why people can memorize complex material and still not understand it. They never stayed in confusion long enough. They jumped from explanation to explanation, stacking words instead of forming insight. Someone like Richard Feynman understood this deeply. He wasn't disturbed by not understanding something right away. In fact, he trusted confusion more than confidence. Confidence could be borrowed. Confusion had to be worked through. There's a philosophical lesson hiding here. We often confuse clarity with truth. If something feels clear, we assume it must be right. But clarity can be an illusion created by familiarity. Confusion, on the other hand, often appears when you're brushing up against something genuinely new, something that doesn't fit neatly into your existing mental models. That friction is not a problem, it's evidence of growth. Think of confusion like intellectual gravity. When you first encounter a deep idea, your old ways of thinking can't hold it in place. Everything feels unstable. The temptation is to step back. The genius move is to lean in, to ask, what exactly am I missing here? Not in frustration, but with patience. Confusion becomes productive the moment you stop fighting it. This requires emotional discipline as much as intelligence. You have to learn how to remain calm while not knowing, to resist the urge to immediately resolve uncertainty. In a world obsessed with speed, this is almost a rebellious act. But slow thinking is not weak thinking. It's precise thinking. It's thinking that respects complexity instead of flattening it. There's also humility involved. Confusion reminds you that your current understanding is incomplete. That can feel threatening to the ego. But if you tie your self-worth to always being right, confusion will feel unbearable. Genius-level thinkers detach their identity from certainty. They don't need to appear intelligent, they need to become accurate. That difference changes everything. When you stay with confusion long enough, something interesting happens. Patterns begin to form. Connections emerge that weren't visible before. The mind reorganizes itself quietly, almost invisibly. And then clarity arrives, not as a memorized answer, but as an internal sense of structure. You don't just know the idea, you see how it fits. This is why confusion should be treated like a skill, not a weakness. You can practice it. You can learn to notice when you're escaping it and gently return. You can train yourself to ask better follow-up questions instead of abandoning the problem. Over time, your tolerance for uncertainty increases, and with it, the depth of your thinking. So the next time you feel confused, don't ask, "What's wrong with me?" Ask, "What is this trying to teach me?" Because confusion is not the end of understanding. It is the pressure that forges it. And if you can learn to stand calmly in confusion, you'll discover that insight doesn't come from avoiding uncertainty, but from staying with it until it gives way to truth. Once you've learned to ask better questions and you have developed the courage to stay inside confusion, the next challenge appears. And this one is subtle. It's the temptation to simplify too quickly, not to understand more clearly, but to feel clear. And those two are not the same thing. We admire simplicity, and rightly so, but there is a dangerous kind of simplicity that lies to you. It smooths over the rough edges of reality, hides the gaps, and replaces understanding with slogans. Real intelligence doesn't avoid complexity, it compresses it honestly. That distinction matters, because you can explain something simply and still be wrong, or you can explain it simply and be precise. Only one of those builds genius. Richard Feynman was ruthless about this. He didn't simplify to impress, he simplified to expose. When he reduced an idea to plain language, it wasn't to make it sound easy. It was to see if anything real remained once the fancy words were stripped away. If nothing remained, the understanding was fake, and fake clarity is worse than confusion because it convinces you to stop thinking. Psychologically, oversimplification is comforting. The brain loves neat stories. It wants cause and effect, chains that fit in a sentence. But the universe is under no obligation to be neat. When we force it to be, we're not learning, We're editing reality to protect our sense of control. Genius thinking requires the opposite move, simplifying without distorting. Here's how you know the difference. Dishonest simplification avoids specifics. It relies on vague phrases like "it just works" or "that's how nature behaves." Honest simplification does the opposite. It removes decoration but keeps structure. It tells you what interacts with what, under what conditions, and what breaks if those conditions change. It's simple, but it's not shallow. There's a philosophical humility hidden here. To simplify honestly, you have to admit what you don't know. You can't hide behind language. When you try to explain something plainly and hit a wall, that wall isn't a failure, it's a map. It tells you exactly where your understanding ends. Most people turn away at that moment. Genius thinkers stay. This is why teaching is such a powerful test of intelligence. The moment you try to explain an idea to someone else without jargon, you discover whether you actually understand it. Your brain is forced to organize the idea into a causal chain instead of a verbal cloud. And if you can't do that, no amount of memorization will save you. There's also an ethical dimension to this kind of thinking. When you simplify without lying, you respect the listener. You're not manipulating them with confidence or complexity. You're inviting them into the structure of the idea itself. That's rare. And it's why people trusted Feynman, not because he made things sound easy, but because he made it clear where the difficulty truly was. In your own thinking, this means resisting the urge to settle for explanations that feel satisfying but can't be interrogated. When you think you understand something, ask yourself, could I explain this to a curious 12-year-old without cheating? Could I point to what would change if one assumption were false? If the answer is no, the idea isn't finished yet. Simplification done right is not reduction, it's distillation. It takes time, it requires patience, and it demands intellectual honesty. But the reward is enormous. Ideas that are portable, flexible, and real. Ideas you can use, not just repeat. So if you want your brain to move toward genius, don't aim to sound smart. Aim to be clear without being careless. Strip ideas down until only truth remains. And refuse to accept simplicity that survives only by hiding what matters most. Once you've learned how to ask sharper questions, stay inside confusion, and simplify without lying to yourself, the way your brain stores knowledge begins to change. And this is where most people unknowingly limit themselves. They treat knowledge like a warehouse. Facts stacked on shelves, neatly labeled, rarely connected. Genius thinking doesn't work like that. It doesn't rely on storage, it relies on structure. Most people are taught to memorize facts, formulas, definitions, rules, and memorization feels productive. You can measure it, you can test it. But facts on their own are fragile. They work only in the narrow context in which they were learned. The moment the problem changes shape, the fact becomes useless. That's why people who know a lot often struggle with new problems. They're trying to recall instead of reason. What separates deeper thinkers is that they build mental models. A model is not a fact. It's a simplified representation of how something works. It explains relationships, not just outcomes. Once you have a model, you can predict, adapt, and improvise. You don't need to remember every detail because the structure tells you what should happen next. This is something Richard Feynman emphasized again and again, often without naming it explicitly. He didn't approach physics as a collection of equations to be memorized. He treated it as a set of ideas about how nature behaves. The equations were just precise ways of expressing those ideas. When you understand the model, the math becomes meaningful. Without the model, the math is just decoration. Psychologically, models reduce cognitive load. Your brain stops juggling isolated facts and starts seeing patterns. Instead of asking, "Which formula do I use?" you ask, "What's really happening here?" That shift is enormous. It turns problem solving from a memory test into a reasoning process. And reasoning scales. Memorization doesn't. Philosophically, thinking in models also changes how you relate to uncertainty. Facts demand certainty. You either remember them or you don't. Models tolerate uncertainty. They can be refined, expanded, or even replaced without collapsing your entire understanding. This makes you more flexible, less defensive, and far more creative. Here's a simple test to see whether you're thinking in facts or models. When you learn something new, ask yourself, could I apply this idea in a completely different domain? Could I use it as an analogy? If the answer is no, you're probably holding a fact. If the answer is yes, you've built a model. This is why genius thinkers often jump between fields so effortlessly. They're not transferring facts, they're transferring structures. A model learned in physics can illuminate economics. A model from biology can clarify psychology. Reality doesn't live in isolated subjects, it's a network. Models let you navigate that network. But building models requires patience. You can't rush it. You have to sit with ideas long enough to see what depends on what. You have to ask, if this were removed, what would change? That's uncomfortable because it exposes weak understanding. But it's also where real insight forms. There's also humility involved. Models are never final, they're approximations. Genius thinkers don't cling to them as identities. They hold them lightly, ready to revise. That's why their thinking evolves instead of stagnating. So if you want to force your brain to think at a higher level, stop asking how much you can remember and start asking how well you can explain relationships. Stop collecting facts and start building frameworks. Because facts tell you what happened once. Models tell you what will happen next. And when you learn to see the world in models instead of memorized fragments, thinking stops being reactive and starts becoming predictive. And that's where intelligence turns into power. As your thinking matures, once you've learned to question deeply, endure confusion, simplify honestly, and build mental models, you run into a quieter but far more dangerous obstacle, the ego. Not arrogance in the loud sense, but attachment. Attachment to being right. Attachment to past conclusions. Attachment to the version of yourself who knows. This is where most intelligent people stall. The mind does something subtle when it becomes identified with its ideas. It stops testing them. A belief that once began a useful hypothesis slowly hardens into a personal asset. Challenging it no longer feels like improving accuracy, it feels like an attack on identity. And the moment that happens, thinking stops being about truth and starts being about defense. Richard Feynman was almost allergic to this kind of rigidity. He didn't respect ideas because of who proposed them, not even himself. He respected ideas only insofar as they survived contact with reality. If an idea failed, it was dropped without ceremony. No embarrassment, no loyalty, just curiosity moving forward. That attitude wasn't accidental. It was disciplined humility. Psychologically, this is difficult because the brain uses beliefs as anchors. They provide stability. Letting go of a belief can feel like losing ground. But there's a deeper stability available, one that comes from trusting your ability to update, not your ability to be correct. When your confidence is rooted in the process instead of the conclusion, being wrong stops being threatening. Most people don't realize how much energy they spend protecting beliefs. They argue not to discover, but to win. They listen not to understand, but to reply. That constant defense creates blind spots. Genius-level thinking requires something counterintuitive, intellectual vulnerability. The willingness to say, I might be wrong, let's see. Philosophically, detaching ego from thought restores honesty. Ideas become tools again, not badges. You can test them, discard them, or rebuild them without emotional resistance. This is how knowledge evolves. Every major advance in understanding required someone to let go of what once felt certain. There's also freedom here. When you no longer need to be right, curiosity expands. You can explore unfamiliar ideas without fear. You can admit confusion without shame. You can revise opinions publicly without embarrassment. That flexibility is not weakness, it's strength that compounds over time. Practically, this means learning to notice emotional reactions to ideas. When a claim irritates you instantly, pause. That irritation is data. It's often pointing to a belief that's become part of your identity. Instead of defending it, examine it. Ask what evidence would actually change your mind. If the answer is nothing, you're no longer thinking, you're guarding. Detaching ego doesn't mean abandoning conviction. It means holding conviction provisionally. You act on the best model you have while staying open to better ones. That balance, commitment without attachment, is rare and powerful. This is also why genius thinkers change their minds more often than average thinkers. Not because they're indecisive, but because they're responsive. Reality updates, so do they. The goal isn't consistency with the past. It's alignment with what's true now. So if you want your thinking to break past its current limits, stop asking whether an idea makes you feel secure and start asking whether it survives scrutiny. Let go of the need to defend conclusions. Protect only the integrity of the process. Because the moment ego steps aside, truth has room to enter. And that's when thinking stops being performative and starts becoming genuinely intelligent. When all of this comes together, better questions, patience with confusion, honest simplification, strong mental models, and an ego that no longer needs to be right, there's one final shift that completes the transformation. You stop treating thinking as a performance and start treating it as an experiment, and that single change alters how you relate to ideas, mistakes, and even yourself. Most people think as if they're on stage. Every opinion feels like a statement. Every answer feels like a verdict. Being wrong feels public, permanent, and embarrassing. So the mind becomes cautious. It avoids bold ideas. It sticks to what sounds safe. But real intelligence doesn't grow under observation. It grows under testing. Richard Feynman approached thinking the way a scientist approaches nature. He didn't expect his first idea to be correct. He expected it to be informative. Every thought was a hypothesis, not a declaration. If it failed, it wasn't a personal loss, it was data. That mindset is quietly revolutionary. Psychologically, this removes fear from thinking. When ideas are experiments, failure stops being evidence of inadequacy and becomes evidence of progress. You're no longer asking, was I smart? You're asking, what did I learn? That question keeps the mind moving forward instead of inward. There's a philosophical honesty here as well. Reality doesn't care about your beliefs. It responds only to interaction. When you treat thinking as experimentation, you align yourself with how truth actually works. You propose, you test, you revise. That cycle mirrors the structure of discovery itself. This also changes how you speak and listen. You stop arguing to win and start discussing to refine. You're willing to say, this is my current best guess, instead of pretending certainty. Conversations become collaborative investigations instead of competitions. And that environment is where insight multiplies. Practically, this means changing your internal language. Instead of saying, I believe this, say, let's see if this holds up. Instead of defending a position automatically, look for stress points. Ask what prediction your idea makes. Ask what evidence would weaken it. That's not skepticism for its own sake. It's respect for reality. There's also a deep humility baked into experimental thinking. You accept that no idea is final. Even the best models are approximations. That doesn't make them useless. It makes them alive. They evolve as understanding deepens. Genius thinkers aren't attached to being finished. They're committed to refining. And here's the paradox. When you stop performing intelligence, you become more intelligent. Freed from the pressure to appear correct, your mind takes risks. It explores strange connections. It entertains possibilities that sound foolish at first. That's where originality lives, just beyond the edge of respectability. This is why so many breakthroughs look obvious in hindsight. At the time, they sounded wrong, incomplete, or naive. Only someone unconcerned with performance could afford to follow them. Experimental thinking gives you that freedom. So the final discipline is this: treat your thoughts the way a scientist treats nature. Gently, skeptically, and with curiosity. Let ideas earn their place through testing, not confidence. Let mistakes inform rather than embarrass you. Let thinking be a process, not a pose. Because the moment you stop trying to sound intelligent and start trying to find out what's true, your mind stops performing and starts discovering.